What's good, mini crafters? My name is Samuel, and on my channel I paint minis, build dioramas, and do other hobby related things as well. In this week's video, I wanted to take a look at something that is often overlooked, but I believe is super important, and that is creating the perfect base for any of your minis. Let's get into it. Many times, when we finish painting a mini, we add it to a base. And this often looks like adding dirt, gluing down some grass tufts, and calling it done. But what if we pushed harder, figured out something a little more complicated, and figured out how to make a badass base for your badass mini? After painting up this awesome Lizard Clan boss, I wanted to give it a sick little base to match. The only question in my head is what kind of base will do this justice. Thankfully, there are a few different tactics that I use when figuring out the best base for any of my minis, and I think that you can use them too. Now, before moving on, I do want to quickly clarify something. There is no wrong way to base your minis. You may have your own processes, steps, and way of going about doing this, and all those can work great for you and are completely viable options. If you paint a mini and throw it on a base with nothing on it, or maybe you just add some dirt and call it good, there's nothing wrong by going that route. I'm only offering how I make my bases, and I think it's really important to try to put a lot of effort into these and really elevate your mini. And this isn't just to get people to focus on the base, but rather it can pull the viewer into the mini and the scene that you set more holistically and really elevate the piece. And I think there's going to be some helpful tips and tricks in this video that you're going to be able to add to your base building toolbox. Here, you can see a Beholder, a Space Marine, a Yeti, and also my mini, all without a background or setting. Now, obviously, this makes each creature seem a bit isolated, but it also keeps you from being visually immersed in each image. Now, as we place each creature into a setting, we start to become more immersed and start to feel out the story of each scene. The dampness of the dungeon that the Beholder is in, you appreciate the exhaustion of the Space Marine after a bloody fight, and you feel the chill of the snowy mountain that we see the Yeti on. All of these settings make sense for these creatures. And with that in mind, I felt like I could see my clan lizard boss in a swampy marsh setting. Now, I didn't create nor do I own any of that art that I just showed you. Rather, I just went on and did a simple Google search to get some inspiration. But this next tactic is usually what gets me really excited about basing my miniature, and that's figuring out the story that the miniature is in. Now, oftentimes when you buy or make your own miniature, you have a story that comes with it. You know, a warrior that's in a town traveling through to fight, the dragon in the village or something like that. But if you can create that story, whether it's already made or in your own head, that can help get you excited about building the base for your mini and kind of figure out how you want that to look. When I began painting my Lizard Clan boss, I didn't really have a story in mind. But as I worked my way through the paint job, one began to form. He has a forward stance, his mouth is open in a roar, and his sword is thrusting out in front of him. To me, that's a battle pose. He's either fighting or maybe he's bolstering the troops around him to make them fight better. This brings me to my next go-to tactic in creating the perfect base, and that's planning it out on good old-fashioned paper. This doesn't have to be super detailed, and you don't have to make any fancy drawing or anything like that. Obviously, you can see that I'm trying to keep it simple here with general shapes and ideas. I'm thinking on the fly, and I'm trying to take what's in my brain and get it out on paper in some fashion. Something that helps me is doing a side view and a top-down view. This way I can kind of start to see the 3D idea on paper before I get out my terrain supplies and get to work. I think I'm going to do something with a rock outcropping, but also create some sort of wooden bridge that extends out from that. This not only gives me a place for the miniature to be situated, but it also works in that elevated war cry pose that I mentioned earlier. The first thing that I'm going to be adding here is cork. I bought these little squares that can easily break off in little sections for bases and other diorama projects. I'm not working in any specific way as I break off the initial pieces of cork. Instead, I'm looking to get small chunks off that I can begin to shape for each layer. Since I'm building this up a bit, I'm going to need 4 or 5 layers of cork slabs to build up to the elevation that I want. If you have thicker cork layers, then you may not need as many. As I'm doing this, I'm breaking off corners of cork, switching out which layer goes in which order, and just trying to build out the shape that I want. Once I have the layers I want in the shapes and orientation that I like, I'm going to be whipping out the old hot glue gun for some quick gluing. You can use other types of glue on cork, but I've found that hot glue works well for me as it cures super quick. If you have another type of glue that you use for cork or in any of your other base building materials, drop a comment down below so we can all learn. I love cork. I think it's really easy to work with. Anyone can get access to it, and it creates really convincing scale rock and textures in your dioramas. However, I see a lot of people slap some cork layers down, paint it up, and say done. And it just makes me want to reach out and say you're missing the last step. There's something that I have found that can be really helpful, and I want to take this moment to explain that and share that with you. Often when they do this, and you look at the base, all you see is the layers of cork with some paint slapped on it. And there's nothing wrong with this necessarily. I actually used to do all of my cork basing like this. So this isn't to make anyone feel bad, but I do have an extra step that can help really bring this to the next level. I found this Liquitex modeling paste in a Hobby Lobby like a year and a half ago. And for the amount that I use, each time I use it, I'll probably die before it runs out. But I've come to find that it is super helpful in filling in cracks and crevices and building up forms. It just depends how you use it. I have my cork layers glued together, and now I'm going to be using this modeling paste to fill in the cracks between the layers, cover some of the areas that have gaps, and this generally makes sure that the whole form looks like one rock and not layers of cork stacked on each other. I'm going to be using an old paintbrush and taking this stuff out of the jar as it is. Now, it's a bit gloopy and thick, and that's enough to hold its shape for me when I push it around. But, like the cork head that I am, I forgot to get footage of what I did on the back side of the cork, so you're just going to take my word for it. For the back, I took some of the modeling paste and mixed it with water in a 2-to-1 ratio. This waters the paste down and lets me sort of coat the backside, almost with a paint consistency, while also getting in all the nooks and crannies. Something else that I did was to create sort of a lip along the edge of the base in the front of the cork rock. Now I'll explain why I did this in a few steps, but I think it's going to really help with this finishing touch that we're going to do towards the end. The last thing I'll say about this modeling paste is it does take a hot second to set up. I usually leave it overnight and let it cure. And once it is cured, you can sand it, paint it, file it. You can do a ton of cool things with it and create some textures with it once it's hardened. With the stone part of the base finished, I'm going to be moving on to the woodwork. I'm using some matchsticks for the support beams, and I'll be using this thin piece of basswood to create little slats that will lay across the top. Now, something that I've noticed when working with matchsticks is that they have little wood fibers, burrs, and flyaway pieces on them that don't really look that great once you've painted them up. But to resolve this, I simply grab some sandpaper and give each sides a few swipes to clean them up. You can see here that while it's a small, easy step, it does make a huge difference. And it'll be even more noticeable once we get the wood painted. But before we do that, I need to get the beams in place on the base and situated on the rock. Now, I'm dry fitting where I think I want the beams to go and moving them around a bit to see if I like the angle compared to another one and to see how I want to place things. Once I get them where I like, I'm cutting them down to be the same length. You can absolutely leave these different lengths if that's the look that you're after, but I chose not to. I wanted them to be as even as I could get them. To get these beams glued in, I'm using just plain old tacky glue and pushing them into place. When gluing things that don't really hold themselves up while drying, I'll use something to hold them in place. In this case, a dropper paint bottle on its side. The tacky glue ends up drying pretty quickly though. While those are drying, I'm going to cut the support beams to size and get those in place as well. I'm going to be using tacky glue again, and with the help of my tweezers, I can get them in under the beams. Now, I just have to let everything dry. So the good news is everything that I've made has dried and is in place. The beams, the rock, all of it. The problem is I'm realizing I may have done this out of order. Normally, when you get your structure made, your landmass put together, all of that, you prime it, paint it, and put your mini on it. However, I'm realizing that if I put the planks on top of the supports, I'm really going to struggle to get primer back underneath and on the cork. And even if I do get the primer in all the right spots, I'm still struggling to get paint in all the nooks and crannies, under the wood and on the rocks itself. Something that I love about this hobby is that it's all about problem solving and trying things out that may not work, but you wouldn't know until you do. So, that being said, here's what I'm going to do. My thought is that I can do a 2-part prime for this base. The first will be a lighter prime, with me focusing on trying to get the underside of the bridge area covered rather than the full coverage. Then, Once the first pass is done, I'll add on the planks and get those secured. From there, I'll come in with some fine medium ballast and add that to the nooks and crannies to give it some extra texture. Then, when all the planks are down and the ballast is glued in place, I'll hit the whole thing with a second coat of primer, this time going for a nice even coat. Now, both the underside is primed and the top is also ready to go. All it just needs is some paint, weathering, and one finishing touch that I've actually never tried before. The first thing that I want to get painted is the wood. This allows me to get paint down, and if some gets on the stone or lower areas, that's alright because I can cover it up later when I paint the stone in lower areas. For the wood planks and support beams, I'm going to be putting down a liberal amount of Agrax Earthshade to start. You'll also notice I have some dirt and ballast on the wood planks. I'm actually going to be using some of the same Agrax Earthshade on that as well as the initial base color. While the Agrax Earthshade is still wet, I'm going to take some Vallejo Flat Earth and blend that onto the boards. This will give me a neat blended wooden color that is slightly aged but not too aged. One thing to make note of, the paint going on is going to look more vibrant and brighter than it will once it dries. It looks more orangey when I first put it on, but once it dries, it'll give it a nice faded look. From there, I'm going to let everything fully dry before moving on to my next step. I'm going to be doing some dry brushing of a lighter tan color. Now, this isn't a specific color from a bottle, rather it's a combination of colors that have sort of formed on my wet palette from a couple of other projects I'm working on. Lots of people want specific paint formulas, and sometimes there isn't one. Sometimes it's just what looks good to the eye. I figure a lighter tan would do a good job complementing the darker shade while also picking out the raised parts nicely. To dry brush well, you need to be sure that you're using a wider brush, not the fancy super pointed brushes that you use for detail work. Funny enough, those plushy makeup brushes work amazingly. However, my wife won't let me use hers, so for now I'm settling with a small, wider brush that still has some good bend to it. You want to be sure that your brush is bone dry, otherwise this won't work at all and you're actually going to end up with torn paint and weird splotches. I'm going to get a bit of paint on the brush, not too much, and then immediately wipe it off on a paper towel in a back and forth motion. It's going to look like you're taking off nearly all the paint, and it's because you are. That's the point. You don't want globs of paint on the brush, otherwise you're going to leave streaks and patches of paint. The whole point of dry brushing is to pick out the texture, the details, and leave paint pigment on just the highest points and edges. As I take my brush back and forth over the surface here, I'm leaving behind a tint of paint as I go. And my rule of thumb is that you can always go back and do a second or even a third pass of dry brushing. But if you start too heavy, the only way to take it off is to put down another base coat and redo the dry brushing. Painting the stone is going to be a bit similar to how I did the wood. I'm going to use a wash of darker browns, grays, and reds and drop those randomly over the surfaces of the stone. I don't want too much of one color taking over the others. Rather, I want a conglomeration of colors to come together and create an overall stony and earthy look. To get a good wash, you just want to make sure that you have enough water mixed in with your paint. Not too thin, otherwise you lose your pigment, but enough to have it run into the recesses. As a sort of opposite to the brighter top side, I'm going to be using some darker browns and grays to build up some more shadow contrast on the backside and underside. As one last punch of color and highlight, I'm going to take a yellow gold color and place it on the uppermost surfaces since the light would be strongest there. I'm going to go over the stone and focus on the ballast on the wood planks. I'm leaving the wood alone, but I think this last pop of color will really help. Now that the wood and stone painting is done, and I've gone in and added my highlights and my shadows, I want to figure out how I can pull a swampy, damp marsh feel into this base. And to do that, I'm going to be using a few different tips and techniques to get that effect. First things first, I'm going to be putting down some refractive green at the base of the wood and the stone. This will act as a base coat as well as a preparation step for what's next, adding the swamp green water gel. This stuff is made by AK Interactive, and they have all sorts of cool textures, gels, and effects that you can add to your dioramas or minis. Now, I've never used this specific product before, so you guys should feel special since you're getting to see me do it for the first time. I did some brief research on this to ensure that I didn't need to mix it with anything, but it turns out it's good to use straight out of the container. The The only thing that I did see all over the internet was that if you do a thin application, it can dry a bit transparent, which is why I put down that coat of refractive green, just in case I miss any spots or if it's thinner in other areas than I intended. To apply the gel, I'm going to use an old brush that I don't really care about and sort of goop it onto the base. Now if you remember, I made a little sort of dam with the modeling paste around the rim of the base itself. This was done as a precaution as I don't have any idea how this water gel will run. It's very possible that it holds its shape just fine, but we'll see.
The next day.
Alright, so it's been 24 hours and this stuff dried amazingly. It looks like real swamp water. I think water effects and things like this just really pull projects together. It's so cool to capture something like this in such a little space. The only last thing that I want to add here is some moss deposits to the top planks as well as to the base of the wood beams that are in the swamp water itself. This is going to further add to the damp, rotting setting that I'm trying to convey with this base. A little bit does go a long way, and once dry, all that's left is to paint the base rim black. Unless you're a psycho, of course. After that, I'm calling this one done. I hope that this video helped give you some helpful tips and maybe inspired you for your own bases for your miniatures. I do want to say there is no wrong way to do a base. This is just how I did mine. There are going to be points where you mess something up. You saw me do it with the primer when I accidentally built too much of the base and wasn't sure how to get the coats even. But you want to make sure that you're working in that trial and error and make sure that you're not being too hard on yourself. It is supposed to be relaxing after all. And remember, the more that you do this and the more that you practice, the better that you're going to get at it. So when you get to those points where you mess something up or something doesn't work out the way that you want, you can look back and see all the awesome successful projects that you've done, and that can hopefully encourage you to keep going and keep trying. That's going to do it for this one, guys. If you want to support the channel, the best way that you can do that is to subscribe, leave a comment below, and make sure you hit that little bell button as well so that you know when one of my new videos drops. All of this helps get my video and channels in front of other viewers like you. Until next time, keep on crafting.